Our reading today comes from the book of Daniel, chapter 5, verses 17 through 31. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. And the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways you have not honored." Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. The word of the Lord.
Thanks. Well, good morning again. Let me drink some water. Yesterday, we had 2 soccer games. First, my son, go Eagles, 3-1, and then last night, pretty momentous historical day for us in Charlotte. There was another game. I'm a little hoarse. We didn't win that one, but I'm hoarse nonetheless. That's why I was yelling so much. The ref was terrible. Hold on, though. Hopefully you're in Daniel 5 if you're not, turn there while I drink this. And then I sang way too loud and way too heartily. Now I'm even more hoarse. All right. A couple years ago, a man went viral on social media because he decided to start a business that was dedicated to nothing more than delivering bad news for people who didn't want to deliver it themselves. It's pretty ingenious in the gig economy. His company is called John Breaks Bad News. His name is John. And his Facebook page has over 130,000 followers. I spent some time this past week on his Facebook page. I don't know if I would recommend it, but bosses hire him to tell their employees that they're not performing well and that they're going to get fired if they don't step it up. Like, isn't that your job, to do that? Doesn't matter. They hire him. Friends hire him to share uncomfortable revelations, maybe some unkind revelations to other friends that they just feel are important, but can't bring themselves to say to their face. Lovers hire him to break up with their significant others, and much worse, which I will not share today. But on and on it goes. No matter how bad, no matter how painful, no matter how uncomfortable your situation is, John has your back, and he will break the news for you. I took a screenshot of one that was appropriate. There weren't many. Oh, you can't see that. Okay, well, this is a screenshot from one of these uncomfortable situations. And I just want you to notice how many times he uses the word bud, as if that's going to help. He says, "Hey, bud, I'm John from John Breaks Bad News. Got some bad news from Finn for you." And his friend, or this guy says, oh, that's a bummer. What's the bad news? He says, Finn says that the girl you've been seeing doesn't actually like you, and you need to get a job because he's not going to pay to help you with buying food anymore, bud. I know this is tough to hear. Sorry, bud. And then the guy literally just says, man, that's really bad news. I think the moral of this story is don't have a friend like Finn, okay? Like, just have friends that will talk to you. The crazy thing about this whole business to me, though, is that he's not the only guy out there doing this. In fact, there was another article in Alexandria, Virginia, that highlighted another guy who wanted to remain anonymous because he has a real job, and this was like his side hustle, and he didn't want to lose his job. And this guy's posting on Craigslist doing the exact same thing. Listen to how he described his services in his ad. He said, feel the overwhelming sense of relief from not having to be the bearer of bad news. Give anxiety and panic the boot. Save time and emotional energy. How? Hire me to deliver the bad news for you. Listen, I share these stories because I don't think any of us enjoy delivering bad news. I don't think any of us like being the guy or the girl that has to go have the uncomfortable or painful or honest conversation. Because not only could you potentially hurt the person that you're sharing the news with, but I think even more importantly, you could get hurt in the process. We have a saying, don't shoot the messenger for a reason. The messengers that bring the bad news oftentimes get the brunt of the wrath and the pain. And so out of self-preservation, we don't like sharing it. It's just easier to hire someone else. Yet one of the things that strikes me about the life of Daniel is that every single chapter of his life so far that we have seen has been marked by him having to be the bearer of bad news. Like literally every chapter of Daniel's life so far. For example, in chapter 1, he's 15. He's newly exiled. He's a brand new eunuch, which we've talked about. He's required now to eat food that's been offered to pagan gods with all of the other exiles. And somehow he's the one who has to go to the chief eunuch and tell him, hey, we're not going to eat this meat. Now, I don't know if they pulled straws and he just got the shortest straw. I don't know if they did rock, paper, scissors, or maybe he just volunteered, but somehow he's the guy that has to go tell this eunuch that they're not going to do that. And if you remember, that's a big deal because it wouldn't just mean that they might get killed, but it also would have meant that the chief eunuch would get killed. So this is not good news, and yet he's doing this. Then skip ahead 15 years, and you're in chapter 2. Chapter 2 now, Daniel's in his early 30s. Again, he has to be this kind of messenger that none of you want to be. Remember how King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of a statue, and there's all these different metals and materials, and they represent the kingdoms of the world and all of this kind of stuff. And he asks his magicians and his sorcerers to interpret the dream, and no one can do it except for Daniel. And so Daniel is forced to stand in front of the most powerful and the most brutal man on the planet and tell him that his kingdom is coming to an end. Not a fun job to be Daniel in Daniel chapter 2. Then skip ahead 20 more years. Now he's in his early 50s, and we're in chapter 4. Chapter 4 was last week. If you weren't here last week, go listen to it again. Same thing happens that happened in chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar gets a dream, only this time it is not about all of these kingdoms. It's specifically about him. And in the dream, he basically realizes that he's going to go insane, and he's going to live as a cow for 7 years. And his hair's going to grow so long, it's going to look like eagle's wings, and his claws are going to look like just insane person's claws. And Daniel, again, is standing in front of this man and saying, this is your future. Get excited. I mean, I can't imagine being Daniel. Chapter after chapter in his life, he is the bearer of bad news to people who could kill him, literally shoot him. Now we get to chapter 5, and 30 more years have passed since chapter 4. King Nebuchadnezzar is dead. Babylon is under attack. Belshazzar, who is not exactly Neb's grandson, but he's ruling in place of his father, who's trapped outside of the city because the Medo-Persian army has just had this major victory. And so the real ruler is trapped outside the city. So his son, Belshazzar, kind of takes the throne. And this is just kind of a side note why at the end he tells Daniel that Daniel's going to be third in the kingdom because Belshazzar is second in the kingdom and his dad's first in the kingdom, but he's not there. Anyways, so he's now with this new king. He's 80 years old, and he's doing the exact same thing that he has been doing for 65 years in exile, delivering the bad news to the evil and brutal and wicked king that could kill him. I can't imagine living this kind of life. What I want to show you today is this message that he has to deliver to King Belshazzar. This incredible sermon, you could call it. And I want to show you how it has massive implications for your life. Like, he's preaching to a king, but the sermon echoes to this day. It resounds for your life and for my life. And the same words that he preached to Belshazzar, he's preaching to you and to me right now. Now, a little bit nuanced, which we're going to see in a minute. But I believe that it's such an important message with so many life-changing implications for our lives that what you decide to do with this message will determine the trajectory of your eternal destiny. It's that significant. Which means it won't just change the way that you live today and determine your destiny here on earth. It will change the way you live forever. What you do with this message that Daniel's about to preach to you. Let me just say, it starts out with really bad news. But if you'll hold tight and you'll hang with me, the bad news has the potential to lead you to really good news. And if you receive it with an open heart, it will lead to the best news in the history of the world. And your life will never be the same. This is what I want to show you today. All right, now listen, before we get into the message, because the message is like halfway through the book, there's a whole first half that I didn't require Meg to read. Thank you, Meg, for reading. It's just too much to read. So I gotta do some stuff with the first half because it's there and it matters. Before we can get to the actual message, we need to understand the context in which it was preached. Because if we really want to grasp what this sermon means for us today, we've got to get a hold of what was really going on back then. This is Bible Study 101, by the way. If you're not sure how to read the Bible, this is where you start. What did it mean for them back then? And then you build a bridge and find out what are those principles that still apply to us today. Bible Study 101. It's just another way of saying if we want to rightly hear and we want to rightly respond to Daniel's sermon, we need to rightly understand his situation. So, his situation begins with a royal party. Look back at verse 1. King Belshazzar made a feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Now, this is really interesting to me because right at this exact moment, the Medes and the Persians are encamped right outside of Babylon's walls. Like if you're into the Viking shows and like the Braveheart shows, ancient warfare type shows, like that's what's going on right now. There is a massive army encamped outside of Babylon and they're trying to do whatever they can to siege the city. Babylon's army, as I just mentioned, has suffered a massive defeat. And their king is trapped outside of the city. The writing is on the wall, figuratively. Literally, it's about to be literally on the wall too, by the way. But figuratively speaking, their days are numbered. Their end is already sealed. And so I love like this whole scene. The end is coming up. It's upon them. The Medo-Persians are outside. And yet Belshazzar is like, let's throw a rager for all the nobles. I mean, that's literally what's going on here. It's a little weird to me. Might not be the best time for a party. Now, historians have debated and conjectured about what's actually going on in this party. A lot of people actually believe that this was his coronation because, again, his dad is trapped outside of the city. He's now the acting king, and that's why there are 1,000 nobles there, because why else would 1,000 nobles be there? And so this party is kind of celebrating his recent promotion to king. And I think that that's probably true. I think another part of it, too, though, which is even more significant, is that this was some type of propaganda party. This is like a propaganda meal for all of the king's nobles to show them that everything's fine. There's nothing to worry about. Everything's under control. And if we're being honest, if you know much about Babylon, and we've been talking about it for a while now, Babylon was okay. They were doing fine. In fact, Herodotus, the ancient historian, said that they had enough food stockpiled to last for years. The river Euphrates flowed through their city, which means they had an endless supply of water. They were stocked and ready to go. Their walls were so high, so strong, you could ride chariots across them. There was no way to breach the walls of Babylon. And so Belshazzar is basically throwing this massive party to convince everyone that everything's okay, and in a lot of ways, everything was okay. Like they couldn't leave the city, but as long as they were in it, they were okay. Now, this confidence leads him to blasphemy. So let's continue looking at the situation. Verse 2 tells us that he took all of the vessels, all of the cups that had been stolen from Yahweh's temple in Jerusalem, handed them to all of his lords, 1,000 lords, and then they drank wine out of them and praised the gods while they were doing it. You guys, this wasn't just a direct insult to the God of Judah. This was actually a dare to the God of Judah. It's like the professor who gets up and he's like, if God is real, strike me with lightning, you know? You ever been in a classroom like that? No, it's just the movies. Okay, good. I've never actually witnessed that in real life either. Christian movies are wonderful like that. But that's essentially what he's doing. He's got these goblets that he's stolen from Yahweh's temple, and he pours wine in them, and he's drinking them, and he's praising all of the pagan gods. And what he's actually doing is daring the God of Judah to do something about it. And I'm going to show you what I mean. You see, the prophet Isaiah actually looked ahead into the future. And do you know one of the things that the prophet Isaiah saw about Babylon? He saw that one day a king named Cyrus, who happened to lead the Medes and the Persians, was going to come and conquer Babylon. Guess who's camped outside the city? Cyrus, who leads the Medes and the Persians and who's trying to take over Babylon. Look at this prophecy with me, Isaiah 45. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped to subdue the nations before him, to loose the belts of kings and to open doors before him that gates may not be closed. Think about the gates of Babylon, by the way. I will go before you and level the exalted places. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hoards and secret places, that you may know what it is that I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who call you by your name. So this is a prophecy about a king named Cyrus coming to take over the kingdom of Babylon. And he just so happens to be there at that very moment. The Babylonians knew this prophecy as much as their captives knew it. And so what I believe is actually going on here, and a lot of scholars have suggested this, is that this whole cup thing from the temple was Belshazzar's way of basically saying, God, I know that your prophecy, and I know that he's here, but I don't think you're actually going to do anything. I think I'm strong enough to withstand your prophets and this anointed that you've brought to my doorstep. And so he's daring God to act. It's intentional. It's a challenge. And I think it's really important to see that. Now, what he didn't know was that Cyrus had this incredible little trick up his sleeve. And even though Babylon was impenetrable and the walls were incredibly massive and high and strong and powerful and nobody could get in, he had a trick and he had a strategy on how he could subvert it. Do any of you remember this story from ancient history? Raise your hand if you remember this. This is like, I think, 9th grade for me. Nobody. 1 in the back. Okay, great. 2, this is like one of my favorite stories in all of ancient history. It's like the Trojan horse, but for me, it's better. Babylon's walls, again, were too high to breach, too strong to breach. And so Cyrus had his army get up on the Euphrates River, and he put a bunch of his troops where the river entered the wall of the city. And then he put a bunch of troops at the end of the river as well. And he told one side to dig a basin at the end of the river Euphrates. And then the other group of soldiers he told to build a canal off of the river so that the water would flow into that basin. So essentially what would happen is the Euphrates River would be redirected to this basin. The basin would turn into a marsh. The river would sink. And then they would be able to walk through under the walls of the city on that riverbed. Isn't that incredible? And so Herodotus describes this whole thing. If you want to read his history, you can. Basically what happens is they do this whole thing. Babylon's not paying attention. Babylon's super cocky. They're throwing parties and all of this kind of stuff. And the river gets so low that it's like mid-thigh. And Cyrus is like, all right, let's go. And so during the time of this party, at this very moment, in fact, Herodotus says it was at the time of a festival. It was during the feast that Cyrus and his army walked right into the city, undetected and unhindered. Everyone's partying. No one even knows what's happening. That's what's going on. Belshazzar challenges the God of heaven, and immediately God responds. Okay, look at verse 5. Immediately. You should circle that word. This is the lightning from heaven. The fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. The king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. So he went from intensely proud to intensely petrified in an instant. I don't know if you've ever had a panic attack before, but this is essentially describing a panic attack. I've had one in my entire life. I have a weird phobia with eyes. If you've been here for more than a year, you know that. I hesitate to even tell you this because everyone always harasses me after I mention this. But I'm going to tell you again, this is the one time I've ever had a panic attack. I was at the eye doctor. I just can't touch my eyes, and I can't watch people touch their eyes. It freaks me out. It goes back to my childhood. You could psychoanalyze this all you want. So I'm in the eye doctor's chair. I haven't been in years because I'm scared to death of the eye doctor. And this guy goes to my old church, and he comes with the eye drops, and he's like about to put the eye drops in my eye, and I try to push his hand away and tell him about my debilitating phobia. And he pushes my hand out of the way, and he drops an eye drop into my eye, and I pass out. And when I come to, I see on the little towel that he has on my chest, like the blue coloring of the eye drops, signaling to me that he had put it in my eye, and then I had a panic attack. So I passed out, I came to, I realized that he had violated my eye, and I had a panic attack, and I lost control of my whole body, and instantly just started sweating profusely. And I couldn't like feel anything. I'm sure I'm already translucent, okay? Like I'm a white guy. There's a color, there's white, and then there's translucent, okay? I became even more translucent. And I just like, he was reviving me for 10 minutes with a cold rag and all of this kind of stuff. I'm not exaggerating. After a while, he was like, listen, I think your eyes are okay. And he sent me on my way. I could have so many bad things in my eyes and I'll never know. This is what's going on here. His color changes, his thoughts alarm him, his limbs give way, he loses all control, he just collapses. It's like Scooby and Shaggy, his knees are buckling together. Like this is literally in the Bible. He knows he's blasphemed the God of Judah. He's challenged him to fight. And now all of a sudden, immediately, there's a disembodied finger writing on the wall. That's pretty wild. You can just imagine this scene. And so just like Nebuchadnezzar before him, he calls all his wise men, all his enchanters, all the Chaldeans. He's like, you got to tell me what this means. None of them can do it because they never can. Zero answers. And so then his mom comes up, and his mom's like, listen, there's this 80-year-old man. Daniel, you've heard of him. He's been retired for a while now. Like they had already put him out to pasture. He's finally at peace. He's like, listen, this guy used to interpret dreams. He used to have this special gift. He did it for Nebuchadnezzar like multiple times. Why don't you call that guy and see if he can do it? So that's what happens. They pull him out of retirement after 30 years of peace and quiet. And once again, he is ordered to stand in front of a king and deliver the bad news. So this is the setting of Daniel 5. It's the propaganda, the arrogance, the blasphemy, and the imminent destruction of Babylon. Daniel's sermon is specifically related to all of this, by the way. Now, in his sermon, he looks back at the reign of Nebuchadnezzar and he gives Belshazzar this crash course of history that he should have been aware of, he should have cared about, but he had just forgotten about, or maybe he had just ignored. He'd chosen to ignore. And Daniel basically says, listen, Nebuchadnezzar was just as proud as you, but God humbled him and then he was saved, but you weren't humbled. You just became more proud, and so now you're in big trouble. I really want to focus on the end of his sermon because I think that this is actually the most important part. I think this has the most impact on you and the most impact on me as well. So what I want to do is I want to read just the last little chunk of the sermon, and I'm going to show you two big things, okay? Start with verse 23. Daniel says, now, you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all of your ways, you've not honored. Then from his presence the hand was sent. And this writing was inscribed, and this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and have been found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Skip to verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Okay, so the big question, what in the world does that have to do with you today? And how in the world could it possibly have an impact on your life? You're not a king. You're not a queen. You're not drinking out of sacred cups, worshiping the gods of silver, gold, and wood, and bronze, and stone. At least I hope you're not. You're not about to be overthrown by some foreign power, killed by a foreign army. So what does this message have to do with you? That's the big question. Now, I would say you could sum it up with two words. And these are the two big ideas I want to show you. The two words are numbered and weighed. Numbered and weighed. First, your days have been numbered, and they're coming to an end. And second, your deeds have been weighed, and they have been found wanting. That's the sermon. So let's unpack it. And like I said, on the surface, it's bad news, it's uncomfortable news. But if you receive this well, it will lead to the best news in the history of the world. Not just to your flourishing today, but to your flourishing for all eternity. So let's look at it. First, God has numbered the days of your life, and they're coming to an end. Psalm 39:4. O Lord, make me know my end, and what is the measure of my days, and let me know how fleeting I am. Psalm 90. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength, 80, yet their span is but toil and trouble. They're soon gone, and then we fly away. So, teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. There is something about the knowledge and recognition of the brevity of life that actually produces wisdom in us, that leads to flourishing, that gives us purpose and hope and even happiness. Understanding that our days are numbered, that those days are really insignificant, they're coming to an end, actually leads us to live life the way it was designed to be lived. In other words, when we learn how to number our days, when we realize how few of them we have, how fleeting they actually are, we are better equipped to live as true humans in this world. For example, in 2014, this is a crazy story. I'd never seen this before. Maybe you have, but there was a company called Ticker. The company came up with the idea of developing a watch that would look at all of our data about health and family background and socioeconomic standing and context and all of these kinds of things, and use an algorithm to try to figure out when we would die. And then they would take that estimate and create a running countdown of our lives. And then they would display that countdown, years, months, days, hours, minutes, and to the second, and put it on a watch. So you could see your seconds just vanishing off of the face of this watch. This is 2014. Obviously, I don't know if it took off. Do any of you have a ticker watch? No? Okay. Now, obviously, no one can actually count down the days of their lives like this because of an infinite amount of things that can either rob us of life or somehow give us life, and we don't really know how to explain it. For example, I watched a documentary not too long ago. This guy's my hero. One of the oldest living veterans, he actually passed away in 2018. He lived to be 112. The dude smoked 12 cigars a day. Okay? Now, I would imagine the algorithm, I would imagine Ticker looked at this guy and did not give him to 112. There are an infinite amount of things. I always tell Caroline this, it can't be bad, okay? This guy lived to 112. There are an infinite amount of variables. It's just a guess. We all understand that. But this is the point of the watch. The point wasn't to try to guess the exact moment that we would die. The point of the watch was to help us grab a hold of every moment of every day. The thought was that if we could actually see the seconds ticking away every single day, that maybe we would be inspired to actually take advantage of them, not waste them. And so they nicknamed this watch the happiness watch because, again, science is always catching up to Jesus, and the science has actually figured out that when you number your days and when you actually consider the brevity of life, it leads to greater purpose and greater joy and greater happiness. So I want one of these watches now. I don't know if they make them. Okay, this is the truth, guys. Our days are numbered. One day our time's going to run out. For Belshazzar, his time was that very night. Now, what you and I need to understand is that maybe our time isn't tonight. We don't know. But we are not guaranteed another breath. We're not guaranteed another day. And so even though you're in good health and you're smoking 12 cigars a day and you're going to live till you're 112, you could go any second. We got to grab a hold of that. It'll change the way we live. A while back, Travis Barker, legendary drummer for Blink-182, was in a plane crash that killed a couple of his friends and ended up killing both of the pilots. I'm sure you saw a lot about this in the news, and somehow he survived. Later on, he was interviewing with Rolling Stone, and in the interview, he said, and I quote, "My crash happened and everything ended. All of my partying, it ended. I didn't go out since my crash. I don't have crazy drug problems anymore. I'm not making out with socialites anymore. I'm focused on my kids and my music, and when I have fun, I try to keep it private, try to keep it safe." Listen to what he said. "I just stopped burping up jet fuel 3 months ago. I feel like death is way over there, and every single day, I'm running away from it." End quote. Guys, every single one of us is one step away from death. It doesn't matter if you're a rock star or a rock mason, if you're rich, or if you're poor, younger, you're old. Every single one of us are living on borrowed time. One day that time's going to run up, and then Hebrews 9 says, we will stand in judgment. And that leads to the second big idea of Daniel's sermon, and that is the judgment. God has weighed the deeds of your life, and they have been found wanting. Guys, whether you realize it or not, you are no different from Belshazzar. And that means your debt is astronomical. Before you protest, before you argue with me and say that I'm being ridiculous and ask how this brutal, sadistic, awful tyrant of a king is not any worse than you, let me just explain it a little bit. You are being weighed next to the same standard that he was being weighed. And you are coming up just as short as he did. Now, from your human perspective, it looks like you are miles apart. But if you were to get up like, I don't know, 100,000 feet, those miles would diminish. In fact, N.T. Wright put it this way, and I love how he put it. This is so good. He said, from God's point of view, the distance from being ordinarily sinful, what we all are, because we're not sadistic tyrants, and extremely sinful, what people we don't like seem to be, or guys like Belshazzar are, is like the distance between London and Paris seen from the point of view of the sun. London and Paris are miles apart, right? And so from Earth, you're gonna have to get on a train, you're gonna have to get on a plane, you're gonna have to go many miles. It's gonna take you a lot of time to get from London to Paris. But if you're on the sun, London and Paris are on top of each other. You can't tell them apart. There's no distinction. And that's exactly what the Bible tells us about our sin. From our perspective, man, we are miles removed from Belshazzar, but from God's perspective, we are one and the same. Now, how can this be, you might ask, because I know that some of you don't believe me right now, because you're good Southern folk, You're in church, for goodness sake. You could have been sleeping right now or brunching at Waterman. How can this be? Well, just think about the 10 Commandments for a minute, okay? Because this is the standard that we're being held to. Let's not even start with the big ones, like murder and adultery, because that's like the big one. I've never killed anyone. Okay, good for you. All right, let's start with a small one, like lying. Teeny tiny. Oh, is that even in there? Thou shalt not lie. That's one of the 10 Commandments. I read a study not too long ago, and this was fascinating to me, that surveyed 2,000 Britons to find out how many times they lied every day. This is wild. Let's take a survey for what it is, okay? But we're talking about 2,000 Britons here. This is so fascinating to me. I just want to stop before I give you the data. How would you answer that question? How many times did you lie yesterday? Or maybe the day before? Let's just take the week. And when I say lie, I mean maybe you told a story in a way that made you look better than you actually were. Or maybe you left out some details that would make you look as bad as you really are. Or maybe you just exaggerated something, or you just told a bold-faced lie. Or maybe it was a little tiny white lie. Doesn't really matter. How would you answer this question? On average, men said that they told 6 lies a day, and women 3, because you truly are our better half. Women are so much better than men for some reason in this way. Now, let's just say you started lying when you were 3 years old. I think that's pretty generous. Claire just turned 3 yesterday. We sang happy birthday all day, and she absolutely loved it. She is the apple of my eye. She is the sweetest and cutest little girl in the world, and I would move heaven and earth to protect her. But she's a liar. It's just straight up. And she does not lie 3 times a day. I'm not even home that long, because I wake up, I help them get ready, I go to work, I come home, I hang out with them a little bit, and then they go to bed, and that girl lies. I don't even know what Caroline's dealing with at home. So let's just say that if my cherub lies more than 3 times a day, you lie at least 3 times a day, okay? Let's start at 3. Now let's just imagine, for the sake of this experiment, that you live till you're 70. You started lying when you were 3, so you got 67 years of lying 6 times a day, or maybe 3 times a day. Let's just go with 6, because I use this for me, so sorry, ladies. You just divide it by 2. So that's an average of 402 lies per lifetime, okay? 402 lies, that would be each one is a felony, okay? So you got 402 felonious charges on your rap sheet. Imagine your rap sheet's like a scroll, and the judge is just throwing it out there, and it just goes. 402 lies. It's a long rap sheet. But then the thing about lying is that a lie is never actually about a lie, or just about a lie. Usually a lie is spoken to cover up something else. It's maybe spoken to cover up pride, or maybe it's spoken to cover up another sin that you've committed. Maybe you were procrastinating at work, and you were looking at YouTube, and and your boss came and was like, hey, why is this job not done? And now all of a sudden you have to lie to cover up the sin of procrastination. And so usually the lie is not just about a lie. You got to add something to that. So let's just multiply each lie by 2. Now what are we up to, math geniuses?
Total is 146,000.
Jeez, wow. I didn't even take it that far. But, okay. Wow, I'm going to talk to you afterwards to figure out how you got that. So I was thinking like 400 times 2 is 800 something, but I'm going to hear how you got that because that's way better for my illustration next time I use this. So now you have 804 felonies and your rap sheet is even longer, okay? So if we're really being honest, this is where we are right now, 804 felonies against a righteous and holy and perfect God. But again, that's not the half of it, is it? Because that's just lying. When Jesus stepped onto the scene, he took the law that we're weighed against, this perfect and holy standard that we've already violated 804 times, and he says, listen, you could follow that thing to the letter. You can never violate a single one of these commands, and yet you would still be guilty of breaking it in your hearts and in your minds. Matthew 5-7, it's just over and over and over again. He says, if you've ever lusted over someone who isn't your husband or who isn't your wife, you're guilty of committing adultery. I wouldn't even dare to ask and survey, what does that look like for you? How many times have you committed adultery this past week? Is there a way to figure that out? The rap sheet's just getting longer and longer. Felonies are piling up more and more. Then he says, if you've ever hated someone in your heart, you're guilty of murder. So let me ask you a question. Have you ever wanted one of your enemies to suffer? Have you ever been happy when an enemy struggles? I have. Sometimes that vindication feels good. Sometimes I even pray for it. And then I realize, the way I judge others is how I'm going to be judged. I'm like, oh, please forgive me for that. Hatred is wanting the worst for other people. Jesus says if you've ever had that in your heart, you're guilty of murder. How would you even quantify? How would you even add that up? Rap sheet's just getting longer and longer and longer. The worst thing about being weighed and measured on the scales of God's perfection isn't the fact that we've committed a bunch of sins with our bodies. It's the fact that we have committed an unknown, infinite amount of sins in our hearts and minds. The rap sheet is miles and miles and miles long. When you put it all together, the grand total is astronomical. It is unpayable. No matter how many good things we do, we will always be found wanting. And that's the message of this sermon that Daniel was preaching. You have been weighed. You have been measured. And it's not enough. You and I are in the same boat as Belshazzar. Guys, whether you realize it or not, I think every single person in the world knows this and feels this. This is why Seneca, the ancient philosopher, the Roman philosopher, once lamented, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, he said, mankind is aware of its sin, but is helpless in doing anything about it. And so we try to do penance. There's all kinds of crazy penance, like Hindus that every 12 years they go to the Ganges River, this filthy, disgusting, just polluted river, and they bathe head to toe in the Ganges River because they think that's going to atone for their sins. In the Roman Catholic tradition, penance is part of forgiveness. And so if you've sinned after your baptism, you go to a priest and you confess your sin, then he gives you some acts of penance. Say some Hail Marys, say some prayers, read some scripture, and then your sin will be atoned for. There's some really extreme forms of penance where people in South America actually go through the act of crucifixion to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, and not to the point of death, but to the point of nails and thorns and all of that kind of stuff, because somehow that's going to purge them of their sin. And guys, maybe you think, I've never done anything as crazy as that, and I'm sure you haven't, but we all have forms of penance. For some of you, it's like virtue signaling on social media. It's like, I just need the world to know I'm not a bad person. I'm a righteous person. I'm a good person. I care about all of these different things, and so all I can do is just type it, and maybe that means something. Maybe that'll help me with my scale. For some of you, it's helping the poor or the homeless or helping the refugee, and all of those things are good things, don't get me wrong. But you're doing it hoping that maybe your good deeds are going to stack up and your bad deeds are going to be outweighed by them. American penance looks just like that. Muhammad Ali put it perfectly. He said, when I die, when I stand before God, he said, I'm gonna tell him, listen, I think my good works outweigh my bad works, and I think that's gonna be enough to get me in. That is what Americans view penance as. And yet Jesus' message to us is Daniel's messages to Belshazzar. You have been weighed, you have been measured, and you are still wanting. It's not enough. So the big question then is, how in the world does this sermon, which is really bad news, lead us to good news? If you're in Christ, you already know. I'm just going to refresh your memory. It's so good. If you aren't, maybe you'll hear this for the first time and receive it with an open heart. The good news for you and the good news for me is that while Belshazzar's time was up, yours isn't. Mine isn't. While he chose to die in his rebellion, you don't have to. The good news of Jesus Christ is that while our rap sheet is astronomical, while our debt is unpayable, it has a definite beginning and a definite end, but his love does not. His love is infinite. And so, yeah, your rap sheet might stretch around the planet, but his love is connected to himself. God is love, and he doesn't have a beginning, and he doesn't have an end, which means no matter how great your rap sheet is, his love is greater. Which is why Paul said in Romans 5, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more, because grace is an overflowing outworking of his love. This is the good news of Jesus. And he chose to demonstrate that love to us in that while we were sinners, he chose to die for us. This is the love of God. Not that we loved him, but that he loved us and gave himself for us as an atoning sacrifice. You don't have to do penance. It'll never work. He came to be your penance, to atone for your sins. Even as our rap sheets grew and our debts multiplied and we stood condemned under the weight of all of our sin, he willingly went to the cross. He willingly bore the wrath of God. He joyfully endured the punishment that we deserved so that he could make us white as snow. This is really, really good news. One of my favorite illustrations of this is the story of a young man who just so happened to be the son of a friend of one of the old Tsars of Russia, Tsar Nicholas. And he had been assigned, this boy had been, or young man had been assigned this job to be a paymaster at one of their fortresses. And the guy had a gambling problem. And so he's in charge of the treasury, he's in charge of the money, and he also has a gambling problem. And of course, you can just imagine where the story goes. It started out small, a ruble here, a ruble there, just to kind of help pay his debts, and then it just kind of spiraled out of control until it got so massive that he realized he'd never be able to pay it. Then one day he received a notice that an official would be coming to their fortress the next day to examine the books and make sure everything was accounted for. And so he's pulling out all of the notes that he's taken, and he's trying to crunch the numbers again. If you crunch them again, something will change. And he's trying to crunch the numbers, and nothing is working. There's no magic to crunching numbers. And he realizes that he is done. And so he comes to the conclusion that the only way out is to take his own life. And so he gets his revolver out, he loads it with bullets, and before he puts it to his head, he gets out a piece of paper and he writes a letter. And in this letter, he decides to outline everything that happened. He outlines all that he had done, how it started small and then it turned into something greater, and how his addiction had led to all of this loss for the kingdom. And he outlines everything that has happened. And then at the end of it, he writes these words, and I quote, "A great debt, who can pay?" A great debt, who can pay? Now, he knew he was going to take his life, but he didn't have the courage to do it, so he got a bottle of Russian vodka, and he just started drinking, and he'd take a drink, and he'd try to do it, and he couldn't do it, so he'd take another drink, and he'd try to do it, and he couldn't do it until he drank the whole bottle of vodka, and he passed out and fell asleep on the table. Gun in hand, confession on the table, empty bottle of vodka by his head. Now, that same night, as the story goes, Nicholas, the Tsar of Russia, dressed up as a soldier and was visiting that fortress as a surprise inspection, incognito. And so he's making his rounds and he's expecting the fortress, and it's late at night and he sees a light on in this guy's office or whatever it was. And he's like, there's not supposed to be a light up there. And so he goes up there and he sees his friend's son passed out, head on the table, gun in hand, empty bottle of vodka, and he looks over and he reads this letter and he realizes what's done, and at first he's incredibly angry. And at first his first inclination is like, I'm going to throw him in prison, I'm going to punish him for the rest of his life till he pays this debt. But then, in that moment, he thought of his boyhood and he remembered his friend, he remembered all of the good times that they had together and the love that they had for each other, and he realized in that moment that if he arrested his friend's son, it would bring disgrace on his friend. It would bring disgrace on his entire family. And so instead of throwing him into prison, he picked up that piece of paper and he looked at the words written at the bottom of the paper, "A great debt, who can pay?" And he picked up a pen and he wrote one single word underneath it. Do you know what the word was? Nicholas. Next day, the man wakes up, immediately grabs the gun. He's like, I tried to do this last night. Now I'm in big trouble because the authorities are on their way. And yet, he looks down at the paper and he sees in large print this word Nicholas. And next to the piece of paper, he sees a stack of gold coins, and he counts the gold coins, and he realizes it is the exact amount that he had lost gambling. He realized in that moment his debt was paid and that he was a free man. Guys, I share that story because that is the good news of Jesus Christ. Every single one of our lives have been weighed and measured and found wanting, but God loves you so much that he sent his son to pay your debt, to forgive your sin, to make you whole and give you everlasting life. He has written his name on your life. So, when your time runs out, when the seconds are finally gone, and then you stand before God in judgment, you will not be standing in your sin. You will be standing in him. And you will have access to the Father and access to the joy of his presence for all eternity. Yes, you have been weighed, and yes, you are still wanting, but he lived the perfect life and obeyed the law without any failure, not a single time, in his heart and his mind and his deeds. So when he writes his name on your life, he's giving you everything you need to have eternal life with him. Some of you need to believe that today. Some of you need to confess that today. You need to acknowledge your sin today, maybe for the first time. Don't be like our former president who said, I don't really have a need for forgiveness. Confess your need. You actually have a massive need for forgiveness. Every single person on the planet does. Confess your need for a Savior and believe that he and he alone is the one who can set you free. Let the bad news lead to the good news, and with it, flourishing, both now and for all eternity. Amen? All right, would you stand?